I think that if I'm remembering correctly, prior to all this happening, the United States had like a 2.5% tariff on the importation of European cars. Well, they have a 10% tariff on the importation of American cars. So one could make the argument that, waving around the giant tariff club and threatening to beat people over the head with it could reduce tariffs. Now, there's another more nuanced, ultimately speculative for now, perspective on these tariffs. And uh, as you sort of alluded to, to what degree is the international trade system sort of natural in the sense of not being distorted by various government actions? And some people would say even that our whole system before Trump got on the scene was more like managed trade rather than free trade. But sort of an added ingredient, and this is not my area of expertise, but it's something I'm quite interested in and have been trying to learn more about, is basically the idea that America's status as the world reserve currency sort of adds another distortion to the picture. In terms of that, there's demand for U.S. Treasuries as sort of a security investment for both other countries as well as private companies, investment firms, etc., all around the world, and that this sort of prevents the international trade accounts from balancing, as it were. The sort of one of the core assumptions of the realist theory of international relations is that the future is radically uncertain, and prudent states take that into account when trying to prepare for it. And the United States would run out of munitions within a month of an actual honest-to-goodness war. Probably with China is the most likely culprit. I don't think that's inevitable, but and similarly for European states, they don't even have. They've been struggling for years to acquire a month's worth of munitions. At one point, I can't remember if it was last summer or the summer of 2023, Germany had less than 20,155 millimeter artillery shells in the whole country. That's 1 to 2 days of what Russia fires. So it is exactly as you say, a matter of prudence. And one could even say that they don't think a conflict with China or Russia is on the horizon. And I don't think they're inevitable for sure. But it's not a question of 10 or 20 years down the road. International politics is a question of 100 years down the road. How are we going to what are we going to leave to our descendants to ensure that they will be well prepared for this, as you say, radically unknown future?
I'm Dr. Randy Bach, and I'm honored to have Zach Yost. Easy to pronounce. I think we both have monosyllabic last names. And he's a freelance writer, free thinker. He writes on economic topics, and I'll let him self-introduce a little bit more before we delve. So Zach, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, Randy. Yeah, I'm freelance writer. I used to work in DC for a while, mostly write for think tanks under my own name. Also do some ghostwriting, things like that, mostly from, sort of free market perspective and also sort of a realist and restrained perspective on foreign policy.
Excellent. So I came across your work, I think through Daniel Klein recommended it, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if you know him, economics professor.
Oh, yes. We frequently chat.
Good. And you had a piece recently on kind of the broken windows concept. I think it's Frederick Basquiat, kind of the Keynesian approach to the war in Ukraine during the Biden administration. Can you speak to that at all?
Sure, yeah. So I've been critical of the war since it started. I mean, I was working on foreign policy back in 2016 in DC when it was sort of these views were much less popular than they are now, even though they're not, dominating at the moment. But uh, the war was avoidable in my view, and people can argue about whether the war, what level the U.S. should be involved in the war, and I of course have views on that. But one argument that I've found repeatedly in the media that is absurd, but touted all the time, is the idea that by giving weapons to Ukraine, we are making Americans wealthier. It's like people complain we're giving them tens of billions of dollars, and then people like Mark Thiessen will say most of that money is actually being spent in America, at the weapons factories and whatnot. And while that may be true, that's only the seen. uh, and you must look at the unseen. What does that cost? And the most simple way to break it down is you could make an artillery shell, 155 millimeter, which I think for the United States costs between $2,000 and $3,000 right now. Or you could do something else with that. You could repair roads and bridges. I mean, literally anything else. There's no increase in wealth by building something and giving it away to be blown up. So that's the kernel of the argument, is that this is a ludicrous idea. And if the logic was applied to the rest of life, we'd be joyous and excited when hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes came. It'd be look at all the work we're going to have to do to clean up from this disaster.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? So Basquiat uses the example of a baker, I believe, right? It's like, what other things he could do. I mean, according to the theory of this is like a broken windows theory, right? You break a window. I owned my office back in the day doing medical practice. And there was an episode, I think in the late 80s, back then, where all the windows up and down, literally Broadway was the name of the street, were shot up by a BB gun or something like that. And this was a big boon for the glass manufacturers. So literally was the broken windows theory at work. So I didn't know of that theory at the time, but it's kind of one of these, make work aspects. This is something that, I think FDR did in a sense, through the WPA and whatnot. And we go look at Rockefeller Center, we see some beautiful murals and whatnot. What's the upside of kind of this make work stuff versus downside? And do those jobs stick? I think Obama tried to do the same kind of thing after the 2008 crisis. Do we react to crises correctly economically and in government? And why do people adhere to this theory? And how does John Milton Keynes fall into this?
Right. Yeah. The short answer is no. We never respond well to economic crises. Yeah, you're exactly right. Bastiat has the idea of the broken window. Someone accidentally throws, a baseball or a rock or whatever through the window into the bakery. And, everyone's mulling around philosophically thinking. And some people would say, well, this is great for the economy because now the glass manufacturers will have work to do. And that's what Bastiat calls the scene. But a good economist will question what is the unseen effect of this. And the unseen effect is that other parts of the economy will now not have the business that the baker would have given them had he not had to replace his window. The baker's no better off. He's out, $200 for the window. And that's $200 he could have bought some shoes with, or hired a new employee, or any other number of things that would have increased wealth. This broken window fallacy ultimately is the idea that by destroying wealth, we can become wealthier. And really, the ultimate, idea of this is that there's some sort of shortage of work or something like that. And ultimately, that's false. Human wants and needs are limitless. There's no limit to how much work needs done. The only question really is how that work, that need is signaled in the market, and how resources will then be allocated to that. And a really great example, you brought up Barack Obama. of this sort of madness was the Cash for Clunkers program,
Oh yeah.
where the government, I was I was like in eighth grade at the time, but they gave like tax rebates or something for people to turn in their old cars, to then have this extra money to buy a new car. And my understanding is lots of old cars were destroyed, but even cars that were pretty new were also destroyed. And so this makes no sense from a sort of the good of American society perspective. We destroyed the used car market, so people who can't afford a brand new car are sort of out of luck. And but it was a great boon to the auto manufacturers, because it's like, oh, well, great, all this new demand for new vehicles. But America as a whole was less wealthy. We had less cars, and so it makes no sense. I mean, it was great for special interests, but not for everyone else.
No, I agree with that because my older son was getting to that. He was that teenage age where thinking about a car or whatnot. He wound up buying my used car I'd had for a decade or 15 years or whatever, down a little bit down the road. But at that time we were thinking alternatively, and the market just like blew through the roof. It was just kind of like a total waste. Um, so obviously these kind of variations in the market are often government um, regulated and caused. At a certain point, I lived in Boston for a long time, and I lived in New York City prior to long time prior to that and whatnot here and there. But when there was a really bad traffic jam, invariably there was a police car at the front of it. There was something that had happened. Now the traffic jams happen organically, ordinarily, and whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons. A lot of people want to do something simultaneously, but at one point or another, sometimes it was just kind of a frivolous stop. I remember, being stopped for like, I don't know, half an hour or whatever in, near South Boston. And I finally got to the front, and it was just a police car had stopped somebody and had choked the lanes, and it was just a routine stop. And I just like, I was kind of irritated with him, and he was like, threatened to arrest me, for not moving on. I'm like, dude, you could have just like moved up a little bit. There was space. You could have done the same thing a little bit further up. And I watched Ayn Rand speak with Phil Donahue just this morning on one of those little Instagram reels, and she was talking about that shortages don't really occur, but for government interactions and so forth. I'm wondering whether as we enter kind of this landscape where there are potential tariff wars and this and that. What do you think of what's does Trump like really want tariffs, or is he using them as just kind of like saber rattling kind of maneuvers to affect other change? How do these kind of distortions play out on the marketplace, and are they already there since other countries are tariffing us, if that's a verb?
Right. Yeah. So that's a super complicated question, and I can just give my speculation on it, because I've it's an art rather than a science trying to interpret what Trump actually wants. Um, I There are some people, sort of free market people, who would say all this tariff stuff just a terrible idea, no matter what, and others would say, well, using these tariffs to extract concessions from other countries, which I was actually quite surprised. I was just reading some levels of tariffs that other countries have on us.
I know,
If
it's
I
amazing.
remember, oh, what was that?
It's amazing. I
Yeah,
was in Japan like 7 years ago, and there's not an American car there, like none, zero.
yeah. I think that if I'm remembering correctly, prior to all this happening, the United States had like a 2.5% tariff on the importation of European cars. Well, they have a 10% tariff on the importation of American cars. So one could make the argument that, waving around the giant tariff club and threatening to beat people over the head with it could reduce tariffs. Now, there's another more nuanced, ultimately speculative for now, perspective on these tariffs. And uh, as you sort of alluded to, to what degree is the international trade system sort of natural in the sense of not being distorted by various government actions? And some people would say even that our whole system before Trump got on the scene was more like managed trade rather than free trade. But sort of an added ingredient, and this is not my area of expertise, but it's something I'm quite interested in and have been trying to learn more about, is basically the idea that America's status as the world reserve currency sort of adds another distortion to the picture. In terms of that, there's demand for U.S. Treasuries as sort of a security investment for both other countries as well as private companies, investment firms, etc., all around the world, and that this sort of prevents the international trade accounts from balancing, as it were. And I'm blanking on his name at the moment, but there's a Harvard PhD economist who has worked variously in the government and was most recently at Hudson Bay Capital. I believe he's also a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, who is Donald Trump's nominee for the Economic Council of Advisors, that to be
Is
the
that
head of that.
Lutnick, you mean, or no?
No, oh no, I think he's the head of the Commerce Department.
Right, right.
Um, and in he some people are looking to him and his writings as a way to interpret the method to the Trump tariff madness. And he basically argues that much like in the 70s when we left Bretton Woods, the America basically is in an unsustainable position with the current international trade and currency situation. And that a trade-off of being the world's reserve currency and the sort of, one might say, distortions or effects that introduces is that it sort of promotes financialization in the economy, but it also and it makes importing things from other countries much less expensive. And obviously, this then comes at the expense of American manufacturing.
Right.
And I'm from Pittsburgh, Rust Belt Central. The you can the economic damage, as it were, that occurred in the Rust Belt, sort of basically in the 70s, 80s, and onward, is, I mean, it's very real, and has had numerous sort of knock-on effects in terms of just communities collapsing into drugs and everything else, deaths of despair, that whole phenomenon. And so one person I'd urge listeners to check out is Josh Hendrickson, who is the head of the economics department at Ole Miss University. And he has a piece actually this week out in the Manhattan Institute's publication. I think it's called City Journal, if I'm
City
not.
Journal, yes.
Yeah, right. Where he lays out a very short version of his interpretation of this other economist whose name I'm forgetting, his sort of views on what's happening. And he is a free market guy, as it were. And he ties this all into the economics of defense, as to why the Trump administration is also motivated to act on this issue in the way that it is. And as I actually just had a piece, I guess now about a week and a half ago, in the American Conservative, talking about the previous administration's plan for sort of jump-starting the military-industrial base, which is in shambles. Basically, we I, as a Pittsburgher, I'm very proud of our contribution to World War II, Arsenal of Democracy and all that. I had, now departed family members who were, welders in shipyards. The amount of Pittsburgh alone produced more steel than all of the Axis powers combined, and Pennsylvania alone during the war produced a fifth. Just the state of Pennsylvania produced a fifth of all global steel. And now, it's sort of tying it back to Ukraine, our ability to churn out the weapons and munitions that are needed now they're just needed at least to replenish our arsenals from everything we've given to Ukraine. But even if there was a good reason for waging this proxy war, which I don't think there is, we can't really sustain the Ukrainian needs. The perfect example of this is 155 millimeter artillery shells, which are sort of, artillery is the king of the battlefield. Historically, something like 70 to 80% of all casualties in wars, in the last century have been from artillery. We have struggled. When the war started, the goal was to ramp up to 100,000 shells a month. We have not been able to do that in 3 years. And there's numerous other examples. Air interceptor missiles, when I believe it was the second time Iran attacked Israel, we fired off a year's worth of production in one day. This, it's sort of the situation is really crazy. And we need, as it were, a manufacturing base capable of filling these needs, which we don't have. And the current international trade system makes that not really possible. So that's all speculative. That's my, not my area of expertise, but my understanding of the situation.
Yeah, no, I get it. My older son's economics major. He has his own couple podcasts. One is called the Pravdcast, pun on Pravda, about Ukraine. The other was Synopsis, which is about China. And so they spend a lot of time talking about kind of geopolitical threats and the engagements, either Russia taking part of Ukraine and or potentially China taking all of Taiwan. The latter would, pose a big impediment to, say, having our next generation of computers upon which to talk. It seems like there's two aspects. I run a household. I guess my wife maybe runs it, and I'm the taxpayer perhaps for our household. So we need to get things coming in and out. So we want a steady, flow of food, and I guess the supplies for heat, whether it's electricity and oil, etc. But at any given moment, you also want to have some kind of reserve. You want to have the capability in case the power grid goes down, or there's some other type of emergency. We saw George Floyd riots, and a lot of people. I mean, we didn't live on the edge of that, but some people did. Some people were on the edge of the seats on the edge of that. So you have to have exigencies. And so how well and how long can you get on if your standard methods of supply don't exist? I'm not a full on prepper, but we have some. I don't want to tell my neighbors, but we have some food, we have some water, this and that. My son is has a solar panel. He's got some battery. It's only going to last a couple of days, whatever. But there's some aspect to it. So what is the buffer? I mean, I think in some aspect the tariff bit is so that you can have a prepper attitude towards potential exigencies. There's a Danish proverb: amongst all things difficult to predict, the future is the hardest. And so at some point, if there's a future that is not that habitable, how can you make it more?
Right. Yeah. The sort of one of the core assumptions of the realist theory of international relations is that the future is radically uncertain. And, prudent states take that into account when trying to prepare for it. And the United States would run out of munitions within a month of an actual honest to goodness war, probably with China is the most likely culprit. I don't think that's inevitable. But yeah, and similarly for, European states, they don't even have they've been struggling for years to acquire a month's worth of munitions. At one point, I can't remember if it was last summer or the summer of 2023, Germany had less than 20,000 155 millimeter artillery shells in the whole country. That's 1 to 2 days of what Russia fires. So it is exactly as you say, a matter of prudence. And one could even say that they don't think a conflict with China or Russia is on the horizon. And I don't think they're inevitable for sure. But it's not a question of, 10 or 20 years down the road. International politics is a question of 100 years down the road. How are we going to what are we going to leave to our descendants to ensure that they will be well prepared for this, as you say, radically unknown future?
I'm going to segue slightly. I mean, it's somewhat related, but it's kind of the economics of defense tied in with my expertise. We see down here it says MD, so that's either mentally deficient or medical doctor. You choose. But I kind of have this thing running around in my head, and you're going to cure it. Where we have become, it's somewhat analogous to the medical system insofar as I consider it paternal. Um, uh, you might have an idea of what shirt you want to buy or what shoes. You go out and buy them, no big problem. You go to Amazon, you get new headphones, etc. But you have a medical issue, you go to the doctor and you ask for X, Y, and Z. The doctor says, Zach, that's really interesting, but we're not going to do that because I am the loco parentis, and I have this decision making possibility and so forth. So that's what I call the parental model. So it's not really a strict economic model like the free market. Has this gatekeeper, and you pay for it because you're getting this expertise and so forth. And probably it happens in colleges as well. You might want to take this and that, but that's not what the college says you should do, and what you need to be accredited for X, Y, and Z. So you have like a limited choice. It's a game theory aspect, whatever. But it's taking that loose model of kind of paternalism to the military field, and then back to healthcare. This is my query. Um, so we provide the lion's share of this thing called NATO against an enemy that no longer exists, for which it was created. That is the Soviet and the Soviet bloc. That's not there anymore. And I don't want to go relitigate Jeffrey Sachs' points. We've kind of moved the border over, like that game of Risk and whatnot, and the Russians don't really like that, et cetera. But we provide the lion's share of defense, and we are the paternal, we are the parents in the room for our children in Europe. And those are, full-fledged economies. You take the sum total of the EU. I mean, it's equal probably to us in population, and economically, you can answer that. I don't know, but very much on par. And yet, they are our child. But they're like a 35-year-old kid in the house, not paying rent. And that kind of thing upsets me a little bit. It's like, dude, yes, the house is here. Yes, you're in it. Yes, we like you. Yes, we might have some, relationship, but you have to pay. You have to pay whatever. Now, and as far as the medical part, we have basically given them the freedom, the liberty, the financial excess by not paying for their defense to have national health insurance and to kind of subsidize the populace and socialize medicine. And here's the kicker question: is I'm sorry for the long detour to get here, but what I see is the system where we are paying full freight for pharmaceuticals because we are the only, say, non-socialist marketplace. So the pharmaceutical companies make their stuff for us, and we want them to have some profit because we want new treatments. We want a new treatment for super RSV or whatever that might come down the road, or we want new treatment for our cancer, arthritis, et cetera. So we want that stuff. We want innovation, but we are the only engine for it, just like we're the only engine for kind of the military base and for protection and whatnot. And yet there's kind of this free rider aspect that Europe has been absorbing for the defense part, and maybe that's fixable easily by our withdrawing and making Zelensky go elsewhere, et cetera. But for the pharmaceutical part, how do we fix that? How do we get this thing that we are paying full freight for our pharmaceuticals and we're not necessarily having the great returns in our longevity and whatnot? Frankly, probably worse because we're getting overtaxed for it.
Right. So definitely not my area of expertise, but I am aware of some aspects of the issue. One reform that I've heard tossed around has to deal with drug approvals and whatnot. My understanding is a lot of that's basically done here, and then Europe just says, "Oh, great, the U.S. did that. Well, it's approved here too," or something to that effect. Whereas my understanding is we do not accept European, approved drugs as counting as approved. So I think that could be one aspect of it. Potentially reforms to intellectual property. Yeah, really not my area of expertise, but I definitely think that it is another area where I have heard that various European regulations and in turn American regulations are facilitating that free riding.
Well, plus they have this kind of monopsony aspect where they can just buy certain drug as a country,
Oh, yes, right. Yep.
and we are buying it more on an individual or insurance company basis, or hospital, whatever, whoever's buying stuff, and we just have, we're kind of like self-flagellating, um, for no purpose. Anyway, so I'll put that out as an idea bubble. Maybe we'll try to attack that, somewhere down the road. But I don't have an easy answer, because it you know maybe it's all tied into the defense thing, where they, whatever some pharmaceutical, company charges us, they have to charge those other countries. And it's all, if you want us to defend you, you're going to have to agree to that. I don't, not per se to make the pharmaceutical companies rich, but to kind of even the playing field, and maybe all the price will go down uniformly, because right now we are, in a sense, welfare subsidizing, their healthcare, on top of welfare subsidizing their defense, which welfare subsidizes their healthcare in
Right.
their own country.
And just to touch back on your point, yeah, the EU has a larger population than the United States, but their economy is actually not on par with ours. It used to be.
Hmm.
Up until the Great Recession, it was about more or less even. It's the EU economy is basically not grown since the Great Recession. The US basically is double, the GDP is basically double the size of Europe's. And if you were to adjust individual EU member states, to adjust their GDP per capita adjusted for purchase power parity and all those sorts of things, almost every state in Europe were to become a US state, would be poorer than any other existing US state.
Hmm.
A few like Germany, I think, and Switzerland would not be in last place, but like the UK, poorer than Mississippi when adjustments are
Right.
made on a per
Yeah, I
capita
saw something
basis.
in the Wall Street Journal probably a decade, 15 years ago, on this concept, which is leaving aside whatever the numerical value of the salaries are. So they're saying, Europe's on par with us for this and that. But if the actual stuff and space and freedom you have around you, and how far you can travel, whether you have a second home. I mean, people in Alabama were doing like better than the par, for Europe at the time, because they have more space. They got like space around them. They got more possessions, more furniture, more, you know, all the kind of the creature comforts, and they have the greater mobility and all that kind of stuff. Now that doesn't necessarily all translate to happiness per se. And a lot of these things, I don't want to get too materialistic about things. But it's something I frankly enjoy, like, like having a little bit of space around, and it's nice having a garden. It's nice, whatever, and it's nice having the ability to go where you want when you want. It seems like there's a kind of a, not economic per se, but there's somewhat of a school marmish, aspect that's happening, through the, it has the word economic in it, kind of like through these World Economic Forum and other economic pushes to kind of pen people in, the 15-minute city and whatnot. And I'm just curious, as a, economic thinker, you know, is this economics, or is this just kind of like, proxy leftism?
Right. Well, to get into that, would sort of have to get into the epistemology of what economics is. But I would say, I mean, in my view, economics is a value-free science. It ideally one would look to economics to say, basically understand cause and effect relations. And World Economic Forum and all that is just weaponizing its understanding of economics in pursuit of its social social engineering goals. I mean, there's nothing really scientific, I mean, economic about it in the scientific sense of the word, is my view.
Hmm. So, political science, is that a science? A social science, is that a science? What are the scientific aspects of economics? The word, I guess, originally comes from oikos or something like that, the home. So when they say actually home ec, that's sort of a redundancy. I don't know if there is home ec anymore, but I kind of see it as a surfing on the poly space of desires. That's what economics is. People like the one example I'll use is, Barack Obama says the oceans are rising and he's there to stop the rising of the oceans, yet he buys oceanfront property, puts his money in Martha's Vineyard and Hawaii and I don't know, wherever else. He's got some places. Um, and so people say something and then they do something that is contrary based on their own kind of like surfing, what I call surfing the poly space of your desire network. Um, so are those other things sciences, and how do we have a scientific method for something that can't be run counterfactually?
Right. Yes. So it all gets down to what science is. They're not science if one's definition of science is basically sort of falsifiable scientific method. But that is not when these words are used to describe different fields as scientific. Really, it's harkening back to a German word, if I'm remembering correctly, of Wissenschaft, where basically
It's like
science is
knowledge work or something like that.
an organized pursuit of knowledge, and various methods are needed for different fields of inquiry. So, I don't know how much you want to go into epistemology here. I have a lot of thoughts if you want to delve deeper, but things like the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, these basically have fixed rules that we've established by countless iterations of understanding the cause and effect. There is nothing like that in economics, even though many people in the social sciences have physics envy, as it were. I once had a professor who literally said that she wished she could run experiments in a lab. Chemistry and physics, we've basically understood through countless iterations the cause and effect relations. If you do X, Y will happen. There's not really we can't establish these exact same sort of laws in the social sciences, and therefore they require a different tool set to analyze. And really, it is, in my view, destructive that so many social scientists have physics envy. They wish they could run experiments in the lab, and that's not the nature of society. And I think it also contributes somewhat to a sort of social engineering mindset. But yeah, it's different aspects of the pursuit of knowledge require different tool sets to understand them.
Fair enough. Um, so let's, I don't know where you want to segue to. I just wrote an article on biodefense bureaucracy for Brownstone. It's about ASPR and BARDA. Um, and these are siloed groups, and they have their various intersections with DHS and the Department of Defense. And they have this kind of purchasing modality, which is very difficult. There's two different types of buying things. I'm not going to get into their acronyms. I think one's FAR and one is OTR or something like that. The OTR was used during the Operation Warp Speed. And Trump did an interesting thing. He tried to get rid of the kind of the red tape, the bureaucracy, in order to have something happen at warp speed. I've written on the Zika virus, which is almost a decade ago that had occurred. And they're still working on a Zika vaccine. They wanted to do warp speed on that. They still don't have it. So I despite leaving aside whether the vaccine was a great idea, whether it's worked well, whether it should have been forced, etc., the speed by which it was created was novel. That has never been done. And so, so I put that up as one example where Trump, the businessman, consolidated for kind of this Manhattan Project aspect to get something done. So that is something where government does something by force, in a sense, and puts everyone together, like the Three Stooges, knocks their head together, and there you have something. But there are large parts of government, in particular this kind of purchasing for biodefense stuff, in this case anthrax vaccine and smallpox and whatnot, that have to kind of be kept alive, as it were, or accessible through the strategic national stockpile. And so they have a situation where there's one company that has been able to figure out all the regulatory morass. And so it's like 40% of your company has to just go for like the paperwork. And if you're a government supplier, you actually have like this reverse colonoscopy where your whole business is discoverable by the government. So every email between the CEO and whatever is discoverable if you're making something for the government according to this pathway. So that's why Pfizer and whatnot, they like stay away from this stuff. Um, but it yields kind of a unique one-to-one monopsony situation where the company, in this case, Emergent Biosolutions, is getting a lot, much more than they would if the thing were open to bid. On the other hand, it's not necessarily a thing that's reproductive model where you're just making shoes every day or making shirts every day and so forth. You're making this stuff and you're stockpiling it, and then you maybe go to sleep for a while, a little bit like cicadas. And every 17 years you need to do that thing, when there's anthrax scare or whatever. So I was pointing out a lot of these issues as far as solutions. How do we get around kind of the way the government, the $500 box of Kleenex kind of thing, the $10,000 toilet. How because we're in Doge land, and frankly possibly at the golden age of restructuring government. How would you if you had 2 cents to put into this treasury, what would you contribute?
Right. So I would point to a recent essay written by I think the chief technology officer of Palantir, called The Defense Reformation. And it's sort of a riff on the 95 Thesis and all that.
Right.
And he addresses this monopsony problem. And one solution he has to this is that, and I'm not sure how this would apply on the biodefense section, but he basically argues that various parts of the government, branches of the military in this case, need to basically act as separate buyers to try and mimic some degree of market functions, so that it's like the Army and the Navy are bidding against each other in the acquisition of whatever. And I've not fully explored the implications of that, but that's one idea that's being floated out there, is to try and mimic some sort of market mechanism. Also, you touch on how difficult it is to do business with the government, especially when it's related to security. And this is something I talked about in my American Conservative piece. The Biden administration released this big report on, I think it was called a military industrial manufacturing based strategy, something like that. Basically, it's like the ultimate effect is we don't have the weapons and whatnot we need, and we don't have the capacity to get there. And the report was mostly trash. It was full of literally like a section on DEI and all sorts of nonsense. But they acknowledge how difficult it is to do business with the DoD. And I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of the British sitcom Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. I joked that this section seemed like it could have been an episode of that show, because they're basically like, it's so difficult to do business with us. But fortunately, we have 8 different programs that a business can utilize to, navigate all of this. So, it's literally like, we're so convoluted, we've created 8 additional bureaucracies to help you navigate this maze. And I think that's ridiculous. All that should be checked out, and procedures should be simplified. Of course, there's a need for security, but I'd wager a lot that things could be simplified and made much easier while still remaining secure.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of rounding out our time. I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and I'm sorry to spring unknown questions to you, but such is life. What are your optimistic and pessimistic versions of the current situation, and what are your without hassling too much, predictions for, say, the next 3 to 6 months of the administration? What kind of challenges coming around the corner? Inflation, is it manageable, et cetera, et cetera? I don't know, just kind of general economic thoughts.
Sure. So I'm sort of short-term optimistic for the Trump administration, as it were. I think they've gotten off on a great foot, as it were. The left, in my views, in total disarray, which was sort of on display during the joint session of Congress, where they just sort of, flopped around, powerlessly, like they're like college freshmen protesting, and the I've compared the beginning of the Trump administration to a blitzkrieg assault, where in a blitzkrieg uh, on a narrow front, penetrate uh, deep into the rear lines of the enemy, and as a result, throw all the sort of communication lines, supply lines in disarray, and then the rest of the front is then stuck and crumbles. And I've joked that this is what Trump has done by attacking on every front at once with great speed and ferociousness. So, in my view, the left is sort of discombobulated right now, and I don't really know how they're going to deal with their internal sort of civil war between the super progressive woke people and the people who are more sane, who are like, this is not going to work to get us elected. That being said, in terms of the economy, I don't think I'm not sure really what to think of the economy. Many, even before Trump took office, there are a lot of signs the economy is not doing as great as Biden's cheerleaders were saying,
Yeah.
Bidenomics and all that. Um, there's all sorts of, whether it's just from honest mistakes or political fiddling with the numbers, lots of questionable stats coming out from the various government bureaus. A really big one was, people were questioning the unemployment figures and say these make no sense. Basically, every month, with like a few exceptions for I don't know how many years, the they'd release the jobs report, then 2 weeks later, revise it down a lot. And then I can't remember now. It was the end of last summer or sometime around then. The job, like they did like the first big revision for I think the 2023 numbers. It was a massive, massive revision downward. Hundreds of thousands of jobs didn't exist that they predicted, and you can, people are like, oh, we have such a great unemployment rate. We're practically at full unemployment. Well, labor market participation is down, and it's been trending down for years, but it has dropped below the trend after COVID. So it's were things to keep going down at their previous rate, we'd have something like, I can't remember, 1 million or 2 million more people in the labor force. And this sort of might segue into my long term, I wouldn't say pessimism, but uh, not optimism for the more long term future. I'm really happy with 95% of what Trump's done, and I'm agnostic on the tariffs to see how that plays out. I think there's a potential, there's a method to the madness. On the other hand, it's sort of what happens after Trump. And I'm not so sure, the sense of it takes a long time to, it takes 5 minutes to destroy something that might have taken 100 years to
Right.
build. And on the one hand, this can work to our favor because Trump is wrecking, with Elon Musk, the federal bureaucracy. And that can't be put together right away. I mean, people are leaving DC in droves. Average home price in DC dropped about $100,000 since Trump took office. Uh, so people, I think, the vast government bureaucracy class might start to worry about working for the government as being unstable, because even if a Democrat were to win in 4 years, there's still the potential, well, the next Republican is just going to redo all this over again. So they might not want to be ping pongs. But on the other hand, progressive ideology has just wrecked the American social fabric. Mediating institutions, family, church, community, are in disarray. And we see this with marriage rates. I'm 31, I'm not married. historical aberration for basically all of human history up to this point, but perfectly average now.
Right.
This has negative consequences in my view. And getting back to all of the labor force participation rate decline, there's been roughly 7 to 8 million prime age working men, which is men aged 25 to 45, who are not working. They're not
Wow.
doing anything. They're called NEETs, not employed, educating, or training. And, from what we know of social surveys of them, I mean, they're on screens, basically the equivalent of, a full-time job, watching Netflix, playing video games. About half of them are on some form of painkiller, whether this is, opioids or weed and whatnot. I mean, they basically have dropped out of society. And at any other point in human history, this would be a great cause of alarm, because having this giant portion of, men in their prime years who are not invested in society, either two things would happen. Either one, they'd leave that society and start raiding, pillaging, conquering their neighbors, or they would overthrow the existing order. So one potential fear I have is that, down the road, some sort of charismatic figure could mobilize these, NEETs, as it were, and give them some sort of existential vision
Hmm.
that could result in, this is all in the context of America's constitutional order is crumbling, in my view. It's, not just in the sense of the words on the paper of the Constitution, but constitutions only work if the people that it's supposed to govern have a constitutional personality, and that's
Right.
in rapid decline.
That's
So
John Adams.
yeah, it's I suppose in the long term, I'm like, we've got a lot more work to do, even though everything Trump is
Yeah.
doing, well, almost
No, I
everything Trump is
appreciate
doing is
that.
good.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. I, I'm a little bit more sanguine, perhaps, because the Trump won, the Trump 45. People went back to work. There was diminishment in the opioid epidemic. It was unspoken of. I have an article at Brownstone on that topic, but we're going to have to call it a day for today. I'd love to continue this discussion with you. Um, open invitation to come back, and we'll try to find some new things to discuss. So thank you so much, Zach. I appreciate your being on.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great time.